I used to work as a traveling nurse, mostly private assignments for elderly patients who preferred staying in their own homes instead of moving into care facilities. I took contracts across the country because the pay was better when you were willing to go anywhere. About 4 years ago, I accepted a 6-month job in Colorado that I still think about almost every day. It was up near a place called Devil's Pass, just outside of Gunnison County. I'd never heard of it, and when I looked it up, all I found was a few hiking blogs saying the trails there were steep, the weather unpredictable, and the area mostly deserted except for a few old cabins built before the 1950s. The agency said my patient was a 78-year-old woman named Margaret Lowell, who needed help after a fall that left her with limited mobility. The job offered isolation pay, which meant it was in a remote location. I figured that meant bad cell service, long drives for groceries, the usual. I'd worked in places like that before. The agency arranged my travel, and the local man picked me up from the nearest small airport. His name was Carl. He drove an old pickup and barely talked during the ride, except to say the road would get rough and that once we got to Devil's Pass, there'd be no cell signal. After nearly 2 hours on dirt roads, we reached a steep incline that curved between two massive rock faces. The whole area felt cut off, like a hidden valley. Down below was a clearing with one house sitting at the edge of a pine forest. It looked lonely, 2 stories, dark wood, sagging porch. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, so someone was definitely home. Carl dropped me off and said he'd be back once a month with supplies if I needed anything extra. Then he drove off, leaving me standing with my suitcase and a box of medical supplies. Margaret opened the door before I could knock. She was small and pale, with gray hair pinned neatly in a bun and sharp blue eyes that studied me like she was trying to decide something. Her house smelled faintly of wood smoke and lavender. She was polite, even kind, but there was something distant about her. She moved slowly with a cane, and I could see the brace under her robe. I set up her medications and checked her vitals. Everything was straightforward. That first night, while I was unpacking in the spare room, she called out from her room down the hall and said something I didn't quite catch. When I stepped closer, she looked embarrassed and said, "Never mind, dear. I thought I heard someone at the door." It was nearly midnight, and I didn't hear anything. I told her I'd check anyway. The porch was empty, the trees swaying in the wind. When I came back, she said softly, "He always comes when the wind picks up." I didn't ask what she meant. I figured she might be confused or dreaming. Elderly patients sometimes get that way at night. The next few weeks were quiet. I fell into a routine, cooking, helping her bathe, managing her exercises. There was no internet or phone signal, so I read books and wrote in a small journal to pass time. But something about that house unsettled me. Every night around the same time, a little after 11, I'd hear faint creaking sounds near the back door. Sometimes a light tap on the porch. I assumed it was raccoons or maybe a branch hitting the siding. One night, while I was reading in bed, I heard the front door latch move. Not loudly, just that soft metal click you recognize instantly if you live alone somewhere. I went to check, heart pounding, but when I got there, the door was shut tight. The next morning, I mentioned it to Margaret while making her breakfast. She didn't look surprised. She just nodded and said, "He's curious about you." I asked who she meant. She hesitated, then said, "The night visitor." I waited, thinking she'd explain, but she just stirred her oatmeal and said, "He doesn't like new people in the house." After that, she started locking her bedroom door at night. I heard it every evening, the soft click of her turning the key. When I asked why, she said she slept better that way. One night in early November, I woke up to footsteps on the porch. Slow, heavy steps that stopped right outside my room's window. I froze. The curtains were thin enough that I could see a faint shadow, tall, unmoving. My chest tightened. I wanted to believe it was Carl or some hiker who got lost, but Devil's Pass wasn't the kind of place people wandered into. The roads were dangerous, and there were no nearby houses. The shadow moved slightly, like whoever it was shifted weight. Then the sound of slow breathing came from the other side of the glass. I didn't move. I stayed there listening for what felt like forever until the shadow stepped away. I waited another minute before running to Margaret's room. Her door was locked. I knocked softly, whispering her name. No answer. The next morning, she acted like nothing happened. When I told her what I saw, she sighed quietly and said, "He used to come for me, but now maybe he's come for you." I tried pressing her for details, but she just said, "He's been here longer than me." That day, I went outside to look for footprints. The ground was covered in frost, and there were faint impressions near the porch, long strides, bare feet. The toes were clearly visible in the frozen dirt. I didn't tell her what I found. I started feeling paranoid, locking my room at night and keeping a flashlight beside the bed. About a week later, during a snowstorm, I woke to banging sound from the kitchen. I grabbed the flashlight and ran down. The back door was wide open, wind and snow blowing in. I shut it quickly, thinking maybe the latch came loose. Then I noticed something else. Wet footprints on the wooden floor leading toward the hall. They stopped halfway, then turned sharply toward the stairs that led to Margaret's room. I ran up and found her door wide open, the light off. Her bed was empty. The window in her room was open, curtains fluttering. I ran outside my socks, shining the flashlight toward the tree line. The beam caught a faint shape. Someone standing at the edge of the forest, completely still. It looked like Margaret, wearing her nightgown. I yelled her name and ran forward. When I reached the spot, she was gone. Only footprints remained, leading deeper into the trees. 2 sets now, hers and larger ones beside them. I followed them until they disappeared into the snow and darkness. The search lasted 2 days. Carl came back early when I called the agency from town using the nearest working phone, which was 10 miles away. They sent local police. They found no trace of her. No body, no blood, nothing. The official report said she likely wandered off during confusion or sleepwalking and got lost in the storm. But the prints I saw weren't hers alone. There were 2 sets. I'll never forget how large the others were, or how clear they looked in that snow, bare feet, even though it was below freezing. I quit that job and never took another remote contract again. I never understood what she meant back then. Now I think I do. I've been riding off-road trails since I was in my 20s. I'm 39 now, and I've covered a lot of desert terrain across Utah, Nevada, and Arizona. I used to go out there with friends every spring, mostly around Moab or the San Rafael Swell. Those open spaces make you feel small in a way that's hard to explain, quiet, endless, and a little unsettling once the sun starts to drop. This happened in 2019, during one of those early spring trips. It was supposed to be a 4-day off-road run through the Henry Mountains and into the San Juan County Flats. My buddy Ryan and I had been planning it for months. We were both into exploring lesser-known routes, places where the maps turned vague and cell service dropped off completely. We left from Hanksville with 2 dirt bikes, a tent, and enough gas to last several days. The first day was perfect, clear sky, cool wind, no one else around. By the second afternoon, we'd made it deep into the Sand Flats area, far from any official trails. That evening, while setting up camp, we found something strange sticking out of the sand a few feet from where Ryan parked his bike. It looked like metal, a rusted handle or a latch poking through the surface. We started digging it out, thinking maybe it was an old piece of farm equipment or part of a car that got buried in a flash flood. It wasn't. After clearing away about 2 feet of packed sand, we uncovered a square, flat panel with a circular hatch in the center. It had faded yellow paint, and a rusted locking mechanism. Around the edges, the metal curved into concrete, meaning this thing was built into the ground, not just dropped there. There were no markings except a small stenciled word that was barely visible. Restricted. We tried pulling on the latch, but it wouldn't move. It was sealed tight. Ryan joked that it might be some leftover Cold War bunker, but even as he said it, he looked uneasy. Later that night, as we sat by the fire, I noticed the sand around the hatch seemed to sink slightly, like the ground had shifted. Ryan said he felt vibrations earlier while moving around the bikes, like something mechanical deep below. We brushed it off as paranoia. When you're that far out, small things get in your head. Around midnight, a low hum woke me up. It wasn't wind or the distant rumble of thunder. It was steady, like machinery running underground. I sat up and looked toward the hatch. The sand above it trembled just slightly. Ryan was already awake. He whispered, "You hear that too?" Before I could answer, there was a sharp metallic clang from below, like a door slamming shut somewhere deep underground. We didn't sleep after that. The next morning, we decided to dig around the hatch again and see if we could open it. After about an hour of clearing sand and prying at the latch with a tire iron, it suddenly gave way with a dry crack. The hatch lifted just enough to release a rush of cold, stale air. It smelled like old metal and dust. We used flashlights to look inside. A metal ladder went straight down into darkness. The walls were concrete, damp, with rust stains running down the sides. I counted maybe 30 rungs before the light disappeared completely. Ryan wanted to go down first. He was always the braver one. I followed. The air was heavy the deeper we went. At the bottom, the tunnel opened into a small corridor lined with steel doors. Everything looked abandoned, peeling paint, broken lights, a few old signs that said things like authorized personnel only and level 2 storage. We walked maybe 50 feet before the tunnel split. One side was blocked by debris, but the other was open. We followed it, thinking we'd find an old shelter room or supply chamber. Instead, we found a hallway lined with glass observation windows. Behind the first window was an empty room with rusted tables and old equipment. Behind the second, though, was something that made us stop cold. It looked like a metal cage, large, bolted to the floor. Inside was a long, dark shape covered with what looked like rotting cloth or canvas. The smell hit us first, a sour, chemical odor mixed with something decayed. Ryan thought it was a dead animal, but the shape was too big. We started backing away. But then we both heard it, a faint dragging sound, echoing from farther down the hall. Not fast, not human. Just slow scraping, like something being pulled across the floor. We turned and ran. By the time we reached the ladder, the sound was closer. Not loud, but steady, coming from the dark end of the corridor. I went up first, Ryan right behind me. When he was halfway, something metallic clanged below, and he yelled that something moved in the tunnel. We slammed the hatch shut and threw sand over it until it disappeared completely. Neither of us said much after that. We packed up and rode until we hit the highway, nearly 50 miles away. When we reached Hanksville, we stopped at a diner. Both of us were shaking. Ryan wanted to go back with better gear and cameras, but I refused. He said he'd at least mark the coordinates so we could tell someone. 3 days later, he called me. He'd gone back alone. He said when he reached the site, the hatch was gone. No metal, no hole, nothing. The sand was perfectly flat, like it had never been disturbed. He sent me photos. It looked exactly like any other patch of desert. That was the last time I saw him in person. 2 months later, his girlfriend told me he'd gone missing while off-roading near the same area. They found his bike abandoned near the flats, but no sign of him. Every once in a while, when I think about that trip, I go back and look at the GPS data from my old tracker. The coordinates where we found the hatch don't exist anymore. The map glitches when I try to zoom in, like the terrain data was wiped out or corrupted. Whatever was under that desert, it wasn't meant to be found. I don't usually talk about what happened during that winter. For a long time, I thought if I just stopped thinking about it, the memory would fade. But it hasn't. It's been almost 9 years now, and I still wake up some nights to the sound of wind against the glass and think about that research cabin. Back then, I worked for a wildlife research program based out of Fairbanks, Alaska. Most of our work involved setting up motion cameras, recording migration routes, and tracking wolf activity across remote areas. The field stations were small one-room cabins scattered miles apart, used mostly for short stays when researchers needed to monitor sites during extreme weather. In December of 2016, I volunteered for a 6-week winter watch assignment. It was extra pay, and all I had to do was collect data from cameras and sensors, log activity, and send daily radio updates. It sounded simple enough. The cabin I was assigned to sat near the edge of the Yukon Flats, miles of snow, frozen rivers, and dense forest in every direction. The supply flight dropped me off with a snowmobile, fuel, and enough food for 2 months. Once they left, the silence hit me hard. It's different out there. No hum of power lines, no distant cars, no voices. Just wind and the occasional creak of ice shifting. The first week was quiet. I set up new batteries in the motion cameras, made notes, and adjusted the temperature sensors. The days were short, light by 9, dark again by 3. By the end of the week, I was used to the isolation. I even enjoyed it. That changed the night I found the first footprint. It was early morning, right after a heavy snowfall. I stepped outside to collect firewood and noticed a single set of footprints about 20 feet from the cabin, fresh, clear, and bare. Not boot prints, not animal tracks, human footprints. At first, I thought maybe one of the other researchers had come through and was staying nearby, but the flight log showed no one else had been assigned within 50 miles. The tracks started near the tree lane and stopped halfway to the cabin, like whoever made them just vanished mid-step. I circled around, but there were no returning prints, just a straight line ending in the middle of the snowfield. I didn't mention it in my daily radio check. I didn't want to sound paranoid. I just logged it as unknown tracks, possible distortion from melting snow. 2 nights later, I woke up to the faint sound of something brushing against the cabin wall. It was soft but steady, like fabric scraping wood. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the window. Nothing but darkness and blowing snow. When I stepped outside, the air was still. My breath came out in thick white clouds. There were no animal noises, not even the usual cracking from the ice. I walked around the cabin once, then stopped cold when I saw them again. Those same footprints. This time, they circled the cabin completely. No other marks in the snow. No sign of where they began or ended. Just perfect bare footprints pressed deep into the frozen surface. That night, I bolted the door and left the lantern burning. Every creak of cabin made my skin crawl. I barely slept. The next morning, I checked all the cameras positioned in the surrounding area. The first few showed nothing unusual, just snow drifting past. But one camera, the one facing the tree lane, had recorded something around 2:40 a.m. A shape moved across the frame. It wasn't clear, just a pale figure walking slowly toward the cabin from the woods. No coat, no shoes. I could see bare skin against the snow. The figure reached the edge of the clearing and stopped. Then, after a few seconds, turned and walked back into the trees. I played it back over and over. It wasn't a trick of light. Someone was out there. I radioed base that afternoon, and asked if any of the old survey cabins in the area were still in use. The response came back a few hours later. Negative. Closest occupied site is 64 miles southwest. The next few nights were tense. I barely went outside after dark, but every morning there were new footprints. Always fresh, always barefoot, circling closer each time. On the 10th night, the radio went dead. I checked the generator, which was still running fine. The antenna hadn't moved. The signal just cut off. That was when I started hearing the tapping. It began around midnight, light, rhythmic knocks against the cabin walls. First on one side, then another. I grabbed the flashlight and checked. But the moment I opened the door, the sound stopped. The tapping went on for 3 nights. By the 4th, I was too exhausted to keep checking. I remember sitting at the small table, staring at the frost on the window, when I noticed something strange. The frost patterns weren't random. They looked like prints. Handprints. 5 fingers pressed flat against the inside of the glass. That's when I decided to leave. I packed what I could, loaded the snowmobile, and took off just before dawn. It was -30 and visibility was terrible, but I didn't care. I drove for hours, following the GPS toward the nearest ranger station. At one point, I glanced behind me, just a quick look over my shoulder, and I swear I saw someone standing in the open snow, far back near the cabin, just standing still, arms at their sides, watching. When I reached the station that evening, I told the rangers what happened. They thought it might have been an escaped hiker or someone suffering frostbite hallucinations. They promised to check the site once the weather cleared. Weeks later, I got a call from one of them. He sounded uneasy. He said when they reached the cabin, they found the door open and everything inside covered in frost. But what stood out were the footprints. A single set of bare tracks leading from the woods straight up to the cabin door, and none going back. They searched the area for hours and never found anyone. I quit the research program after that. I couldn't spend another night alone in the field. The cabin was never used again. They said it was too remote to bother maintaining. Sometimes I check the coordinates on satellite view. It's still there, a small black dot surrounded by endless white.